All right, so a couple things before we get started with this PowerPoint. Number one, today's PowerPoint is going to be a bit shorter than typical. This would probably be less than 15 minutes. It's just going to be a brief overview of the city of Florence and its role in starting the Renaissance. Number two, this is the last PowerPoint lecture that you guys will see on video. Next week I will be back, so Monday morning when you get to school I will be there. I am looking forward to being back, and I know you guys are looking forward to not having to listen to these PowerPoints on YouTube and would prefer, obviously, to, well, I assume you'd prefer to have me in there teaching you as opposed to just you listening to a recording. So please, in this last week, make sure that you have looked over all the assignments that you've had over the past few weeks, particularly the writing assignments, and make sure they're all done and completed and turned in. Over the course of this week, I'm going to be going over a lot of those writing assignments and grading them. So your grades will change as the week goes on because I will begin to be inputting a lot of the grades that I have been slacking on. And so please make sure that they're all done and complete. You can use any time that you working on Quizlet or whatever it might be to look over and make sure that stuff is done. All right, so let's get started. So the city of Florence is a city in Italy, and it's considered the birthplace of the Renaissance in a lot of ways, and this is a city that in more ways than other cities has changed the world. Before we get started on how Florence did it, let's talk about city-states, because that's what Florence is. So if you look on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint screen, you'll see that there's a map of Italy, and you see that Italy, which you guys can see is kind of shaped like a boot there. This is where the Savoy and the Republic of Venice and Milan, that's actually the cutoff line for where the current country of Italy really ends. But you can see it's made up of all of these small countries. And these countries are called city-states. So city-state is a word, is two words that has a specific meaning. City, meaning that each of these states here had one city that was kind of the big city in charge. So if we look right here, Milan is right at the center of Milan. We see the Republic of Venice, and we can find, where did Venice go? There's Venice right there. We can see the Republic of Florence. There's Florence in the center there. And so what makes them a city-state is that these cities, these big cities like Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, they controlled all of the surrounding countryside. So they were kind of like the capital of these little states. And so this was the way that Italy had been governed for hundreds of years now. And these little kingdoms were controlled by the most powerful city in the kingdom. And so that's why they're called city-states. And so most of the surrounding area around these cities was countryside with agriculture and farming. And the cities used all the agriculture and farming to feed into these powerful cities. And so because they were each their own little governments, they had different style governments. Some had one person ruling, like a dictator or an autocrat. Some cities were democratic, where people could vote on things. It just depended on the culture of the city-state. And so we're going to focus right here on Florence. You can see Florence, unlike Venice or Naples, is not located along the water here. It's located in the center of its city-state, which will and have big effects on its economy. And let's get moving. So in 1425, right about when the Renaissance began, the population of Florence was about 60,000 people. Now, that's roughly 3 times the size of Chowchilla, but that's roughly only about 10% of the population of a city like Fresno. So for this to be a very important city, it would seem to be pretty small. But back then, there weren't very many cities that had large populations of people. Most cities were small compared to cities today. The world's population was much smaller than it is today. So 60,000 back then was an enormous city. Chowchilla, if it was transported back then, would be one of the biggest cities in Europe, which is funny to think about, but it's true. So Florence was self-governed, and it was a republic, meaning the city was run by a group of people, not one person. So a republic is where you have people who are elected to act on your behalf, meaning that people are elected and they make decisions for the city. So just like the United States has Congress people that go to Congress and make laws, in the same way the city of Florence elected people and those people made decisions for the city. The city had a bustling economy. Bustling is a new vocabulary word. It means to be very busy and having lots of stuff going on. And there was a lot of money moving around. Florence was really the capital of banking for Europe. And we're going to talk about banking and what that means and why it's important for the city of Florence and where that wealth came from later. All right, time to talk about guilds. So the city of Florence was really at the core run by guilds. A guild, some of you may have heard of the word guild. It's something that's used occasionally in video games. But a guild is really just a group. It's an association between a group of people. And that group of people all have the same job. So let's say, for example, let's say that a bunch of students in the class decided that they were going to all make not scrapbooks, they're all going to make graphic novels. And so there's a bunch of you that wanted to make comic books. And instead of trying to outsell each other on comic books, what you could do is you could work together to come up with a set price for how much you want to sell your comics, so no one would underprice their comics. So let's say one student here wanted to sell their comics for $1, another one wanted to sell it for $1.25, and then one student wanted to sell their comics for 25 cents. Now that person who is selling their comic for 25 cents is probably going to get more sales, potentially, and then force the other people selling their comics to drive down their price even lower. And then everybody in that scenario loses money. So instead, they would get together in these guilds and they would set prices for how much they think they should sell things for. These guilds would also train people. So let's say there's a student who's not very good at drawing. Then that student would go to this comic book guild and be taught how to draw. And they would learn how to draw so then they could also get in the business of producing comic books. And these guilds, because they had so many people involved with them, were able to control a lot of parts of the city. They were able to decide what the city would do, how it would be governed, and they would use their power to protect their industry. So let's say one student tried to make graphic novels illegal. The guild, the graphic novel or comic book guild in our classroom, would then get together and go tell Mr. White that they shouldn't make graphic novels illegal because it's how they make money. So that's the basics of guilds. And then back in 15th century Florence, the guilds were, had to do with art, with manufacturing, with industry, there's so many different types of guilds. Shoe cobblers, clothing makers, painters, all sorts of types of guilds. But the most powerful of them was the textile workers. Now, textile is a fancy vocabulary word which basically means clothing. The textile workers were the largest moneymaker for the city. They would sell their clothing all over Europe. and this clothing was considered some of the best made clothing, and so they were able to charge large amounts of money for their clothing. They purchased their wool that they used to make their cloth from England or Spain, and it was transported to Florence, where then textile workers in the city would weave it or sew it to make cloth. The spun wool was then primarily sold to other important city-states in Italy. And because these textile workers brought so much money into the city, that means they get a lot of power. That's true even in our society today. If you work in a job that's very important for the economy and it brings in a lot of money to the United States, you become very important, primarily because you're giving so many jobs to America, and your money is really helping America continue to improve. And so the Textile Guild had a lot of power because of how successful they were. All right, banking in Florence. Okay, so on the right-hand side, you see a gold florin. This is the coin that was used in 15th century Florence. This coin is a symbol, really, of the power of banking. So most Italian city-states made money from trading. So if we go back to the slide with the regions of Italy, you can see a lot of these big cities here with the little stars are close to the water. And these cities that were close to the water primarily made money through trading. So ships would come into their ports and goods would be exchanged, and the city would charge tax money so that they could make money. And so this was how a lot of money was made. Now, Florence was not along the coast, and so that means it had to make its extra money some other way, and so it did that primarily through banking. Now, if you remember, banking means that a group has a large amount of money, and what they do with that money is they loan it out. So let's say you wanted to start your own lemonade stand, but you didn't have money to pay for the boards to build it, the glasses for the lemonade, the pitcher, the sugar, the lemons, and you knew you were going to make a lot of money at your lemonade stand, but you didn't have a startup money to get going. If you're in 15th century Florence, you might go to a bank, and the bank would say, well, we'll give you $100 to start your lemonade stand, but you're going to have to pay us that money back with some interest. And so in about a year, we'll expect $125 back on our loan. And so you would use the $100 to buy all your stuff for your lemonade stand, and then you'd start making money. And at the end of the year, you'd be expected to return the bank $125. So the 100 that they loaned you plus interest for borrowing money. And so lots of people made lots of money in Florence by doing exactly that, by loaning money out. The type of money that was used in Florence, again, was the gold florin, and it was considered by the rest of Europe to be the most reliable coinage. Coinage is a fancy word of saying money. Most reliable, but instead we don't say money here because it's specifically coins. Most reliable type of money in Europe. And so if you had gold florins in other countries, they would easily be accepted by businesses in other countries because they were considered very, very valuable. And the banking was so successful in Florence that actually Florentines, people that were from Florence, began to open banks in other European cities. So there was a bank in London, there's another bank in France, there's banks that were run by Florentine bankers all over Europe. The most powerful banking family was the Medicis. They were a family that was in Florence for hundreds of years. They would, at one time, rule the city completely to themselves. At other times, they were simply the most powerful people in the city. And they made a large amount of money through banking. And they decided to use this wealth to really kickstart the Renaissance. And so they used this wealth to pay for artists to produce art. and literature. And they began collecting important books written by Greek and Roman authors. And they amassed a huge library, which would be used by people in the city to really study ancient ideas. And these Medicis would continue to rule and support artists for hundreds of years, and they are by far the most important family in the starting of the Renaissance. Entertainment. So what did people do for fun in Florence? So the money that was made in Florence allowed for many kinds of entertainment. A lot of the entertainment was still religious in many ways. So there were regularly religious plays that were performed, not only for entertainment but for learning, so people could learn the stories of their religion. They held horse races on feast days. They had lots of parties in the streets. It was a very exciting city because there was a lot of money flowing around, and so a lot of money for parties. And so people in Florence partied like no one else in Europe really at this time. So here's the big question, and the question that you'll need to be able to answer. Why did the Renaissance begin in Florence? Based on what we've talked about so far, what made Florence special? Well, there are three reasons that we will talk about briefly. Number one, money. So the wealthy bankers and merchants supported the artists by paying them to produce art. If it wasn't for these wealthy bankers and merchants, the artists would be forced to do different kinds of jobs because they had to make a living. If the choice for you as an artist was between starving or making your comic book, you're probably going to choose to avoid starvation by taking a job that's maybe not art related, so you can feed yourself and maybe your family. But wealthy bankers and merchants allowed artists to both make money and produce their art, which was the reason why they were able to spend so much time producing the art that would come to represent the Renaissance. Second reason why Renaissance started in Florence was history. So Italy was the home of the Roman Empire, and that legacy left an influence on the culture of Florence. So in ancient Rome, there was a lot of art, there was a lot of beautiful architecture, lots of books were written about philosophy, and so that culture still lived on in the city of Florence even after the Roman Empire had fallen almost 1,000 years before. And so a lot of these books were found, a lot of the art was seen on old Roman buildings, and this culture really left an influence that people wanted to emulate this important empire that was in Italy's history. And finally, the last reason for why the Renaissance began in the city of Florence was the government. Florence, again, was a republic, and republics, because they elect people and people get to choose who their leaders are, naturally respect the opinions of individuals. And so because they respect the opinions of individuals, individuals can make statements, they can write books with ideas, they can make controversial art, they can do all sorts of things that if the government did not respect the opinions of individuals, they would not be allowed to do. So these are the three main reasons why the Renaissance started in Florence. You'll need to know and understand these. Make sure that you have completed the PowerPoint quiz and get started on the vocabulary for this week.